Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Cameron Rummel. I'm the interim curator at the Living Prairie Museum. I'd just like to remind everyone that this session will be recorded, so please ensure you stay on mute for the duration of the presentation. I'd ask that you type any questions you have into the chat window and I'll read them out loud so that they're included in the recording. I'm going to hold all the questions until the end of the presentation, but feel free to type them into the chat anytime. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd first like to acknowledge that the Living Prairie Museum and the City of Winnipeg are located in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Innu or Cree, the Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. So I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening, John Morgan, the master prairie ecologist and owner of Prairie Habitats Inc. So John has an honors degree in zoology and ecology and a master's in natural resource management from the University of Manitoba. John has had a long and storied career as an ecologist and has worked in Canada's high Arctic, as we were just talking about, and as a farmland habitat stewardship specialist for over 7 years. Later, with his wife, he founded Canada's first prairie restoration company, Prairie Habitats Inc. in 1987, where he grew over 150 species of native prairie plants and seed for 18 years. He co-wrote books, including Restoring Canada's Native Prairies, and contributed to the Tallgrass Prairie Restoration Handbook. He developed and manufactured native seed harvesting equipment now used in at least 46 countries worldwide. John has advised numerous national and international conservation agencies, landowners, schools, undergraduate, graduate students, teachers, prairie enthusiasts, all on native prairie restoration. He's also presented at conferences across North America and lectured at the universities of Manitoba and Alberta. He's also taught native landscaping courses at the Living Prairie Museum for over 25 years. So John still grows local native seed at his Argyle, Manitoba farm and spends as much time as he can enjoying and restoring our prairie heritage. So, hey, John, welcome,
hey,
and take it away when you're ready.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much, Cam. It's really a treat to be here and to talk about my favorite topic, which of course is prairie and restoring prairie and all things native seed. So tonight I'll be talking a bit about how I approach restoring native prairies. As an ecologist, I maybe take a slightly different bent than some people, but I think it's a good background to have if you're trying to call yourself a conservationist and trying to do something real about conservation these days. Sometimes it's really difficult. We get bombarded on all sides of all of the terrible things that are going on and how much more we need to do. Sometimes it's very difficult for myself and I think other people too to know, where we should go. So tonight, I hope I can give you a bit of an introduction into how I look at our native grasslands here in Canada and the other grasslands I've been lucky enough to be on in the United States and in Europe. It's as a prairie boy growing up on the prairies here in Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta, it was I think kind of a natural for me to get into this field. And people always ask me, what I'm doing now and stuff, and what I'm working at. And I said, well, I've never worked a day in my life, and I don't plan to start now. So I've always just had fun, and it's an incredible learning experience too. And nature keeps you humble. But tonight, I hopefully will give you some ideas of what maybe you can do in conservation. And this is, although I will be coming at this from a Manitoba tall and mixed grass prairie perspective, this is the principles and techniques that I talk about here are also, they are applicable to pretty well every other ecosystem in North America, if not worldwide. We are facing an ecological crisis, of course, as most people know, and restoring original local communities with seed from their local area is extremely important and is one way, one very important way that anybody can help, and anybody can learn from in doing this and make a big difference. Even a small planting of species that are probably gone from many areas of the world, even bringing them back in a small way in somebody's backyard, even on an apartment balcony or a city park or boulevard or an agricultural field, is a huge way of getting us more in touch with the land and bringing these endangered ecosystems and the species that depend on them back to life and back as part of our lives, as they were in many places until relatively recently. So I'd like to start off, I guess, with a couple of definitions. We hear the word ecology a lot. It's bandied around like everybody knows what it is. And surprisingly, even biologists don't always realize what this is. And I think the thing that most people don't or may not think of right away is that ecology involves people too. And I've put people here in the definition first because we have I guess the dubious distinction of being the one species on this planet that probably has the most effect on every other living thing here. Likely no other species in the history of this planet has done anything like we have. We've done some really great things, we've done some awful things, and we've done many things in between. But ecology is that relationship between us, the land, the plants and animals, and their relationships among themselves too. And every organism on this earth, depends on its surroundings, its environment for survival. And those species, be they a bird, be they a plant, be they a whale, be they a fungi, be they one of our human race, affect the environment and each other in very diverse and complex ways. And for whatever reason, I've always been interested in ecology. I think to me, it is one of the most interesting areas of science, probably one of the least known and one of the most complicated too. It is incredibly complex. So that is what makes it so interesting. And when we find out a little bit about it and how to restore the ecology of an area, to me, that there's almost nothing that's more exciting than that. Ecologists like to draw these little diagrams. They're called kind of a food web. Basically, this is looking at the society, if you like, on a typical North American prairie. This is kind of generalized. It's not specific to any particular part of North America. So you see kind of at the bottom of the picture, the soil and the organisms that live in the soil. I like to liken the soil on a prairie as the tip of the iceberg, kind of. So the soil is most of the iceberg that's under the water that you don't see. So the soil is most of the living material and the non-living, the geology and the soil particles that is underground and is hugely important to the rest of the system. And we understand almost nothing about the soil and soil processes. It's here where nutrient cycling takes place. Carbon is taken from the atmosphere by plants, put into the ground for long or short-term storage. We hear a lot about carbon storage and carbon sequestration. Well, prairies are incredibly good at doing that. The plants that grow upon those soils are food for many insects, for many grazing animals, from small little mice to huge bison and everything in between. Then there's other animals that prey on those. And then there's even top predators that prey on some of the other animals. And of course, humans are right at the top of that. But without this web, I guess, of the ecology on the prairie, none of the life, including our own, would be possible. Most of the world's croplands that feed 8 billion people are based upon a grassland system. There aren't that many that use forested land. Unfortunately, that's being done more and more now in the tropical rainforests, and that land is very, very unsuited for long-term agriculture. Prairie soils, if they're managed properly and they're taken care of with incorporation of native species especially, can basically be sustained forever. Another term that you'll hear a lot, and probably you'll hear me use, I don't like to use big words, scientific words, they bother me, but biodiversity or biological diversity is something that you will hear bandied around like people know what they mean. And again, even my cohorts in biology, sometimes they miss the point here. But basically, it's a simple term. It's all of the life on Earth, and starting off with our genetic makeup, the genes that make our bodies grow and evolve and change, species diversity of plants and animals and other critters, and then diversity of ecosystems, from prairies to forests to marine ecosystems to wetlands, desert, you name it. There's many different ecosystems around the world, all of them with their own unique species, and all of the species in there with genetic adaptations to help them survive in what sometimes is a very difficult environment. And why do we always focus on biodiversity? So biodiversity is something that is kind of a basic principle, and you'll just kind of have to take my word for this. But over the maybe 50 or 80 years that ecology has been studied, we found that the more species there are, and the more diversity we have, the healthier and the more resilient the whole system is. And so that's a very important principle in ecology, and something that kind of guides most of the work that I've done. And as I mentioned, there's three types of biodiversity. There's genetic, so there's many different genes, and that relates back to the evolution. Animals and plants and other organisms that live in an area and have been there for, in some cases, thousands, some cases, millions of years. They have, through our genetic code, which is unique to every one of us, but also very similar from us to almost every other living thing. Those genes are well adapted, and they also are still changing. Every species alive is a work in progress. So our environment has changed over the years. The changes that we're seeing right now that are mostly human caused are happening at a rate that is almost breathtakingly faster than almost any other time on this planet's history. And so our genetic and the plant genetic adaptations to things like the climate, like the soils, like you name it, the food supplies, that's what allows us to change and allows us to make sure that we can survive. So these the genes in our genetic code have been around since life began, some almost 4 billion years ago. So that's pretty valuable. And having a variety of genes too gives us and the other critters on this planet the ability to adapt and change as things go, and to survive in the long run. Species diversity, of course, the different species of plants and animals. Give you an example, Manitoba alone, we have 700 and some species of plants that are found here. We have about 400 species of birds. We have maybe 100 species of mammals. Nobody knows how many species of insects we have. Worldwide, we think that we've probably only identified maybe 30% of the insects, so the rest of them are yet to be discovered. And then ecosystem diversity, and ecosystems are always in flux, they're always changing, they're never exactly the same from year to year, and that's important too. So those are just kind of some definitions that I wanted to get out of the way at the beginning tonight. A thing that often helps to illustrate a lot of these principles in biological diversity is kind of called a pyramid, I guess, a pyramid of life. At the bottom here, we have, say, a grassland with maybe some shrubs growing in around the edge, some of the species of grasses and wildflowers. I think in Manitoba, we have somewhere around 150 species of fairly common native flowers and grasses on our prairies. We have additional species, of course, in the forested regions, in wetlands, and up on the tundra. And then there are grazing animals at the next level, sort of the middle level here. So that could be anything from insects to bison and everything in between: deer, antelope, rabbits, hares, you name it, ground squirrels. And then the next level up towards the top of this pyramid are the carnivores and omnivores, things like coyotes, which can eat insects, but they can also eat rabbits and mice. Wolves, which used to occur on the prairie and now really don't very often, they could eat just about anything, including the bison. And of course, the cougar or mountain lion and the grizzly bear, those were all critters that were found on the prairies. Cougars are making a slow comeback. Grizzly bears are wiped out about at the time of the bison. Here in Manitoba, the last wild plains grizzly that was recorded was in the Turtle Mountains south of Brandon in 1885. So, but they're maybe making a comeback as well, coming back from the Arctic. So how do we lose biodiversity? Well, as this very sad picture from the New York Times shows, this is what's happening in much of the tropical forest of the world, both in South America and in Asia. And the loss of biodiversity is almost exclusively because of the activities of people on this planet. And so because of that, I mean, that's pretty sad. And you see these orangutans, which are not long for this world now, but their forest community that they've lived in for probably a million years is going down the tubes. But the fact that we are doing this and we are causing much of these problems also means that we have the solution in our hands too. And there are many of them. And I think one of the things that I've always noticed when talking to people and doing educational things and that in schools is that people often talk about the loss of animals and plants in the Amazonian rainforest or maybe in Southeast Asia. We tend to know more about what's happening and be more concerned about what's happening in other countries than in our own backyard. Yes, it's a real concern in the Amazon and in Southeast Asia and pretty well everywhere else that there is mature tropical forest. But the situation in our own backyard, right here in Canada, our tallgrass prairie in Manitoba and Southern Ontario, there was two places where it occurs. It used to be quite common in Southern Ontario, and it was quite common in Manitoba, especially southeastern, south central Manitoba. We have less than 1% of the tallgrass prairie that was here only 100 years ago. So it's essentially gone from the landscape. As you go further west in Manitoba and then across Saskatchewan and Alberta, we have what we call the mixed grass prairie. The mixed grass prairie is a kind of a combination of short and tall grass species. Species are shorter where it's drier, they're a bit taller where it's wetter. So you kind of have those two kinds of prairies together, and that goes all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And on the mixed grass prairie in Manitoba, we have less than 3% of our prairie here, our mixed grass prairie left. Across the rest of Western Canada, there's maybe another 15%. So it's around 20, maybe a bit less than 20% of the mixed grass prairie, which is most common in southwestern Manitoba, southern Saskatchewan, and southern Alberta. So they've lost a lot of it there too, and it's going fast. Some recent statistics from the Canadian Wildlife Service have shown that we are losing in the mixed grass prairie region of Alberta and Saskatchewan over 1 million acres of native prairie a year. And those are being lost to industry, to settlement, to agriculture, highways, you name it. And those are all human-made causes. So whenever I go and talk out in Alberta or Saskatchewan, everybody there knows about the loss of our tallgrass prairies and how we only have 1% left here in Manitoba. I say, well, if you folks aren't careful, you will be just as bad as we are in my lifetime. And that's something that is a real wake-up call, I think. And it's a wake-up call for all of us. Even in Manitoba, where we have less than 1%, we are still losing a significant amount of that 1% every year because most of it's unprotected. Other types of prairie in Canada, we have the interior grasslands in the mountain valleys, the Kootenay Valley, Fraser Valley, and those areas. Somewhere around 30 to 50% of those prairies, prairie grasslands remain, but they are also being gobbled up at an incredibly high rate. I'm not really sure of the percentage loss, but it's pretty high. And then the aspen parkland, what we call rough fescue prairie, is kind of a transition zone between the prairies to the south and the forested regions to the north. That area is less than 5% remains, and that is in a band across western Manitoba, central Saskatchewan, and central Alberta. So, you know, we are losing a lot of rainforest and other habitats, but boy, we're almost at the top of the heap here when it turns out to losing habitat here on the prairies. And so that's not something that a lot of people know too much about. This is a picture from a family photo album here of my wife's grandpa, who homesteaded up in the Swan River Valley in the early 1900s. Building his first house in about 1910, and you can see the prairie around it. It is incredible. I took a look at this and with some software enhanced these images here to see what these plants were in the foreground, because one of my hobbies is looking at old pictures and seeing if I can identify the plants in them. And there's not many that are as good as this one. So there's goldenrods in here, there's asters, there's prairie sage, there's sunflower, there's a variety of other species in here. And this is what that area of grassland in west central Manitoba looked like about 100 years ago. And you have to go a long, long ways there now to find even a small fraction of this. And this is, of course, has happened right across Canada, North America, and the loss of our native grasslands. We're still losing them today, as I mentioned. Here's one not too far from where we are here in the Interlake region of Manitoba, a beautiful tallgrass prairie that we had been managing and doing a whole bunch of work on, was bought up and put into a new subdivision. So, and there was nothing that could be done. It was on private land, so it had no protection. And other things happen too. There's always areas of prairie every year that end up being bulldozed and made into parking lots, to highways, industrial areas, and other areas that are plowed up to put into annual crop production. So there seems to be a real lack of incentives in our system, in our society here, to keep these areas intact and to appreciate the values which they have, and which are many and varied, and I'll go into in a minute. So what happens when we lose these prairies are critters like this. The greater prairie chicken is gone now from Manitoba. It's technically what we call extirpated. It's not extinct. It still survives in the United States, in the Midwestern prairie regions of some of the US states there. But the greater prairie chicken, back in the from the 30s through to about the late 50s in Manitoba, was quite abundant. This is a very spectacular bird, fairly closely related to our present day sharp-tailed grouse, which is still here and doing fine. But the prairie chicken basically was wiped out by a combination of development, changing the landscape from native prairie into agriculture, taking cattle pasture and turning it into cropland, and then turning it into urban areas like the city of Winnipeg. My dad had some stories. He grew up in St. James, not too far from Living Prairie Museum, and he had stories of seeing lots of prairie chicken just around where the airport is now. And when he was a kid growing up, he was born in 1916. So it was really, you know, quite amazing. But this is some of the things that happen. There's many other species that are still with us, but they are on decline. And these are all grassland species. There is a disproportionate share of endangered and threatened species in Canada and worldwide that rely on grasslands. Here's some good examples. The ferruginous hawk, one of the largest hawks on the prairies, the mountain bluebird, which are these beautiful bits of blue sky that you can see in still in a few places in Western Manitoba. And of course, our meadowlark, which is becoming less and less every year. It's iconic prairie bird, a small little songbird that many people don't notice, but when I first started working on the prairies in the late 1970s, these birds were quite common around Brandon, and we covered much of southwestern Manitoba. Now you can hardly see them and find them, and they only live in native prairies, and so they're declining as well. The Baird sparrow is another one that's officially on the threatened list. The bobolink, very spectacular and very melodious songbird, is also becoming of concern and is less and less almost every year, and it nests on the prairies. And probably one of the flagship species, although this is not a Manitoba species, it occurred more commonly in the drier mixed grass prairies of Saskatchewan and Alberta and down into the sort of the western states of the US, is the sage grouse. These are critically endangered. Less than 50 of them are left in the wild in all of Canada. And they're only around Grasslands National Park and adjacent areas around many berries of southeastern Alberta and southwestern Saskatchewan. Spectacular, largest member of our grouse family, and they're pretty well gone. And that's because of the loss of grasslands. And then, of course, everybody knows the story of the plains bison. There were somewhere around 60 to 80 million of these in the early 1800s. By 1880, there was about 300 left, and they almost disappeared as a species. The same happened to the pronghorn antelope. They weren't as common in Manitoba, although they did get here, probably more so in the Souris River Valley. They were almost wiped out as well, but for a different reason. The bison were simply just shot out of existence by market hunting and basically a political decision to try to get rid of the bison from the governments both in Ottawa and Washington, and they did a really good job. The pronghorn antelope almost completely died out because of fencing for cattle on the prairies of Western North America. The pronghorn, although they are probably the fastest mammal. They can run upwards of 70 miles an hour at short bursts. They were trapped by miles and miles of fencing. They would not jump the barbed wire fence. And if they couldn't go under them, they would walk and walk and walk for miles until they starved or ran out of water. And so millions of them died before we learned how to make fences that would keep the cattle in, but allow the pronghorn to pass through. And they're doing quite well now. So that's a success story. Another success story, lest you think that all of the things I'm going to talk about are doom and gloom, they're not. Manitoba, as well as the other prairie provinces here in Canada, have a very active and very successful recovery project to reintroduce burrowing owls. And these cute little birds are gorgeous little critters. I remember seeing them quite commonly in southwestern Manitoba in the late 70s and early 80s. They're pretty well gone from the wild now, but through this dedicated group here, and then also other groups in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and down into the US, they're being brought back onto the landscape, and it's been a real success story. So it is possible, but it isn't possible to have them make their nests in parking lots. They have to be on a native prairie. And so that's, if you need an argument for having prairie around, then some of these species will help you with it there. The black-tailed prairie dog, they were wiped out in Manitoba and almost in Canada. There's only one colony left, and that's in Grasslands National Park. These are not to be confused with the ground squirrels, which some people call prairie dogs. Ground squirrels are still fairly common, and they're not really endangered, not yet, but they might be in some point in the future. And one of the main predators on the prairie dog, the swift fox, these unbelievably gorgeous little foxes about cat size. I got a chance to see one in Saskatchewan at their release center one time, and I'll never forget it. They are just gorgeous, and they've been able to very slowly start to bring them back. So hopefully at some point we'll see these back on the prairies here in Manitoba, but you can see them occasionally now in southwestern Saskatchewan and southeastern Alberta. So like I say, I don't want to be all doom and gloom, and it is something that you know, I tend to get a little bit discouraged at times. And just the other day, somebody reminded me, she said, well, you know, you're always talking about this, John, but what can we do? So I thought, okay, well, I guess I'll put my money where my mouth is. So if you're about to ask that question, then I'll provide the answers. And even if you're not, I'll provide the answers here. Anyway, I'll try to give you some suggestions. So what can we all do? Well, first of all, is to learn as much as you can about ecology and about how we all depend on ecology to keep us alive, to keep us fed, to keep us with water and clean air and a place to live. That's all any critter, including humans, need. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize depends on the ecology and how we can affect it. Volunteer with conservation agencies. I've worked with many different NGOs all over the place, both here and in the US. And they're always looking for volunteers. I'm sure Cameron would back me up on this at Living Prairie. Every other group that works on conservation and environmental issues worldwide relies on volunteers. It's a difficult sell. We are going against what some people consider to be economic progress, what some people consider to be the way things are. And if you've got enough money, you can do whatever you want. But those people also depend on the ecology. And when you have volunteers going up against well-paid lawyers for the other side, it can be a really uneven, a very, very uneven game. So volunteering with special skills that you might have, everybody has a skill. And I was listening to a Aboriginal elder today on CBC, and she was talking about this. It was really amazing. And everyone has a skill. And if you want to help in this, use your skill, be it in music, sing a song about the value of nature. You can speak, you can educate others, you can help to raise funds, you can donate some funds, you can do all kinds of things. And those are some of the things that we can do. Find something that you're good at and try to use it in the service of the environment. And the last but not least is to remember to vote and take a look at the policies of whoever you're voting for. And if they don't mention ecology, and if they don't know anything about what's going on in this field and how critically endangered our species is becoming, then I would suggest you look for a party or an individual that does, because it's certainly something that's something that I strongly believe in. And people who don't vote also, because they think there's no point, they are just playing into the hands of the people that are really not doing a good job. Anyway, so, and the other thing you can do is, why not use local native seed? So this is a segue, I guess, but anyway, that's what I'm going to be talking about. That was John's ecology lesson for the evening, but there's a lot of different ways of using native seed. And this is one big part of the environmental issue that you could have a pretty good input on. And hopefully I'll give you an introduction into that tonight that'll maybe help you want more. There are many, many reasons that native seed can be used and used a lot more than it can be. And by native seed, I'm also including native plants. I'm not really differentiating between the two. You don't have to grow everything from seed. There are native plant nurseries now that specialize on native species almost anywhere in Canada, anywhere in North America, and many other parts of the world. We've been lucky enough to work with people from many different countries on this topic, and to see the incredible advances that are going on in many places. So it's not all doom and gloom by any stretch, but there's a lot of things. I won't reread these, you can read them yourself, but there's an awful lot of things in native plants that can benefit us. As I mentioned, biological diversity, there's all kinds of wildlife, building soil. Native prairie, for example, is incredible on storing carbon. About 4 tons per hectare or 4 tons per acre of carbon can be stored from a diverse native prairie planting every year in perpetuity. Basically, the plants take in carbon dioxide, fix the carbon into the root system, and build the soil. So they're making an almost permanent carbon storage by doing that. 4 tons per hectare, or 4 tons per acre per year. So it's also amazing. The plants on the prairie have amazingly deep root systems, so they're incredible at holding the soil. Here in Manitoba, we have a real problem with Lake Winnipeg and all of the soil and silt and nutrients that get flown off, or that run off into the lake every year, is basically killing the lake by promoting algal blooms and oxygen depletion and fish die-offs. So, you know, there's a huge role for native plants to take in building and preventing erosion. There's nutrients that cycle in the soil. There's the carbon cycle, there's nitrogen, phosphates, you name it. There's all kinds of different cycles going on concurrently that we don't really even know about, but that keep us alive and keep all of the other parts of the biota alive. There's other things too, like potential crops and medicines. While we fill most of human nutrition with 3 species of grass: corn, rice, and wheat. And so about 70% of all of our nutrition as a species comes from that. And I always wonder, what if the ancestor of corn or wheat or rice, which were native somewhere, corn was native to northern Mexico and the southwestern United States. Rice is native to Asia, wheat is native to the Middle East. What if some previous civilization had wiped out the ancestors to those plants? Where would we be today? So just think about that. And we haven't even looked at this more than a handful of species of native prairie plants to see what potential they could have for us. There's new food crops, there's medicines, there's all kinds of beneficial things in there we haven't even looked for yet. So eliminating much of them, like we have in Manitoba with less than 1% of our tallgrass prairie, eliminating that is really shooting ourselves in our foot. There's incredible historical ability and interest in native species. When I'm sitting out on a prairie and the wind starts to blow through the big blue stem, which will be shoulder high or maybe a bit higher, I can't help but imagine being here 1,000 years ago and seeing a herd of 2 million bison walk by. You know, it would have been just amazing. And that helps, for me anyway, it helps to bring that landscape back. It helps me experience it in my imagination. If you're just growing plants for a garden, our local native species here are adaptable. They're hardy. They've been through floods. They've been through droughts. They've been through incredible winters. They've been through the glaciers. They've been through just about everything, and they've thrived. You can't get better adapted plants for your landscape than native species. And they're also beautiful. They're just incredible. They're just as gorgeous as any selected variety that you might get in a normal greenhouse. There's nothing wrong with those. Don't get me wrong. I love seeing all kinds of different plants. But when I see the incredible beauty on a native prairie in a harsh, windy environment that has frost levels that go down 4 feet in the wintertime, it's just amazing, because many other plants would not survive that. So, so just some examples, I guess, of maybe what you can do with native plants. Many of us, if we have our own home, have some kind of a landscape on our front yard. And many times it's just a bunch of Kentucky bluegrass, which is not even native to Kentucky. It's a European grass that was brought over for agriculture and now has escaped and is widely naturalized, as we call it, and invasive actually, and taking over many native prairies. But you know, there's 70, 80 species of native grasses that we could use that are native right here on the prairies. there's probably at least over 150 species of native wildflowers across the prairies. And here's some examples here of just a few of them in a yard in Winnipeg in St. Patel. Things like the bergamot here in the foreground, in the background, some white spikes of Culver's root, some yellow coneflower, some brown-eyed Susan, some yarrow, some switchgrass, you name it. There's in this particular yard of some good friends of mine, they have over 50 different species. It sure looks different than the neighbors and across the street, but happily, this is becoming more and more acceptable. And this is becoming not even acceptable, more and more, not, I wouldn't say the norm, I don't think we're there yet, but this is a really viable alternative to your typical cultivated and biologically, or your close mowed and biologically sterile lawn, which is usually just surviving on chemicals. Here's some other examples of using native species in industrial landscaping. This is a project that was on Taylor Avenue in River Heights in Winnipeg, where the old Manitoba Hydro head office used to be before they moved downtown. So kind of a before and after here with the building in the background, about 3 years apart, and a 2-acre tallgrass prairie planting with over 45 different species that were seeded and live planted into this site. And landscaping around hydroelectric transmission lines and towers is not exactly the kind of thing that, you know, you would think of as being the norm. But this, when we did it on this site, took a couple of years. It was not an overnight thing. It's not like rolling out sod and saying, presto, you've got something. But this was pretty amazing how well it worked and how well it was received by the folks that we work for at Hydro and by the community as well. The Forks in downtown Winnipeg, the first native planting in all of Canada on a public site was started there in 1988. And a landscape architect that we worked with, Cynthia Kohlmeyer from Winnipeg, had the bright idea, just the vision really, of putting some of Manitoba's native landscape into a part of the city that was probably the most disturbed. The area at the Forks was where Winnipeg began, and as long as I can remember, it had been an industrial site. It was part of the railway yards. It was kind of abandoned for many years, and then of course in the 1970s and on, it was redeveloped and has of course become a focus now of the city of Winnipeg. And through Cindy's efforts and approaching us and getting us involved in putting something in, it was just amazing. And now much of the Forks landscape is native prairie and native wildflowers and grasses. So this is something that can be done. And when you put a native landscape into an urban area too, then I think it really softens the many hard edges, the concrete, the big buildings and that type of thing, and makes it a more human landscape. Not to mention the fact that it brings in butterflies and songbirds and all kinds of things. So I think it makes the city a lot more livable. Another project on a different scale was for a conservation agency, a non-government organization, Nature Conservancy of Canada, was well known for their conservation work and purchasing and preserving native Canadian landscapes, as well as their arm in the United States, the Nature Conservancy there. They are well known for their efforts in this area. And one of the projects that they did here in Manitoba involved collecting 122 species of native wildflowers and grasses. We had over 1,600 pounds of 122 species, and we put it in on an 86-acre site. It took 2 years to do this. It was a huge effort, probably the largest seed collection and diversity project that I'm aware of for sure anywhere in the prairies. It worked out really, really well. I couldn't find my pictures today, but if anybody wants, I can find the pictures that I took last summer, and shoulder high grasses and wildflowers as far as you can see, in what once was an alfalfa field and had been abandoned for over 20 years. Another thing that we've done is pioneered the equipment end of harvesting and collecting native seed and using native seed, you can imagine that if you're going out and doing a large scale restoration like one on 86 acres with 100 and some species, you're not going to go out and collect that seed by hand. Some of it was for sure, but much of the probably 90% of the seed was used or was collected with machines that we developed here, seed stripper harvesters that had been around since about the turn of the century, but really hadn't been used to harvest grass seed since about the 1960s. We kind of revived them, modernized them, added nylon brushes and hydraulics, and made a machine that was very easy on the land, very gentle on the land, but a very efficient harvester. Basically just stripping the seed off the plants, just as you would if you were bringing your hand up through a seed head and stripping it off. So we mechanized that process. We did this initially for our own use because there was no way of harvesting seed when we started other than by hand at one extreme and with large agricultural combines at the other extreme. There was literally nothing in the middle, and no existing manufacturer was interested. So we got into making machines here and testing them out, and they worked better than our wildest dreams. And before we knew it, we had a machine shop busy, and we have built them now, and they are in use in 46 countries around the world. This is a couple of them here. Some of the seed collection equipment that we started with, my good friend and partner in crime, Doug Collicutt, had developed his milk carton harvester here. So this allows you to staple 6 milk cartons together, put lunch bags in each one, and collect a different species in each when they're clipped to your belt. So that's a pretty low-tech way, but you're not going to get 100 pounds of seed there in a day. But this is one way of doing it if you've got small amounts and you have lots of volunteer labor. The other thing we developed, Doug especially, had developed a modified weed eater or line trimmer to make it into a high-speed, low impact but high efficiency hand seed harvester that could be used in various different places. Some of my favorite pictures from our customers are these folks in Italy. There was 2 national parks in northeastern Italy in the Alps that bought some of our machines and took them up right away to harvest wildflowers in alpine meadows up in the Italian and Austrian Alps. This is one fellow here from one of the NGOs working with them. Another one was a place that I'd been, and way back in about 2000, we went to the Orkneys, and I didn't meet this fellow, but we talked to some of the other staff there, and there was grassland all over the place. It was almost like a prairie, and it was native grassland. And so it turns out that this ring of Brogar, which is like a smaller version of Stonehenge, and it's about 4,000 years old, they were using our seed harvesters there to harvest seed for restoration in other areas. Australia, we have a bunch of our harvesters out there doing similar work with conservation, both government and non-government conservation agencies there with Australian native species. A couple of other projects I'd like to mention to you that shows you what can be done with a little bit of effort and some really far-reaching planning into the future. In Iowa, for example, is a place that I've been a couple of times, mainly because they have a place called the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa in Cedar Falls. And so they've established a trust fund there in Iowa that every year grants, I think it's about $3 million to local counties or municipalities in Iowa. And there's about 99 or 100 counties in Iowa. 75% of those counties have done native plantings, and all of their seed has come from local Iowa remnants. Now, Iowa, there isn't much native prairie left. It's mostly soybeans and cornfields, but they really manage their existing native prairies and they use them for seed production. And if you drive down through Iowa, either along the interstates or the state highways or even the county roads, the section roads, you'll find mile after mile after mile of native wildflowers and grasses. And now they collect the seed off of their roadsides. It's just amazing. This was a cornfield that we saw near Cedar Falls. No signs or anything, but getting out there was at least a dozen different species of native Iowa tallgrass prairie species there, some of them approaching the height of the 10-foot corn you can see in the adjacent field. Other places that we've worked with in Florida, they have a wildflower seed cooperative there. Texas has a native roadside wildflower program that dates back to the 1930s. It's a huge tourism draw there. It brings over $200 million into the rural economy in Texas of tourists just coming to see the roadside native plants. Minnesota has something similar, although maybe not on as large a scale, but they have developed, the state of Minnesota is kind of rectangular in shape. They divided it into 4 quarters, and the governments there, both the federal and state and municipal governments, only buy seed that have been collected and grown in their quarter of the state. So it's just amazing. They're preserving that genetic diversity, and they've planted over 30,000 acres in Minnesota alone of native prairie along the roadsides. Other states too, this is just some example of some of the roadside plantings in the US. The US also has a federal highway program for encouraging native plants, and that is funded federally by over $250 million grant directly from the US federal government. So it's just amazing. I mean, I know that we can't do the kind of scale that some of the American agencies have the resources to do, but we can certainly do it on a smaller scale. And now there seems to be some interest in doing this, and I'm really hoping that this will continue. This is also a great place for business to take advantage to get involved, do something very useful for their community, and get known for their conservation efforts. It has some great PR benefits and also some fantastic environmental benefits too. A couple of other agencies that we've worked with in the past here is the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture Plant Materials Center. They're kind of like the Canadian version of the old PFRA ag research stations. And the Americans have these in a variety of regions across the states, including in Alaska, of all places. And you wouldn't think of Alaska as having much agriculture, but they do. And they're harvesting here beach wild rye on sand dunes just up from the high tide line along the Gulf of Alaska, and using it at the Plant Materials Center. Another place that we've worked with is the Department of Agriculture in Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands. So here they're harvesting native fescue. Another example is in Florida, where there's an endangered ecosystem called the longleaf pine savanna. And here you have 100-foot pine trees that are 6 feet in diameter at the base, basically with a tallgrass prairie understory. It is the most incredible ecosystem that I've ever been into. And we were so pleased at being able to help them with some of their equipment needs. Back home, closer to home here, CFB Shiloh out in western Manitoba. Here we're harvesting little bluestem and about 25 other species or 40 other species for restoration work for the military out on the ranges, and also for Enbridge pipelines that goes nearby. So have you ever seen 25 pounds of pure goldenrod seed? Well, there it is, bottom right-hand corner. And that was harvested in about 30 minutes, sorry. And one of the last projects, I guess, a big project that is in the works. It's on the shelf in a government office somewhere right now. But we started work on this a number of years ago, about 10 years, I guess. And the long-term plan is to put the Red River floodway banks back into tallgrass prairie. This is 8,000 acres. There's that much right-of-way next to the Red River floodway east of Winnipeg. And can you imagine what an incredible bonus that would be to see that back into tallgrass prairie? So we made a start, and I hope that future governments continue on. So I think I probably said enough about my view of native seed and what we can do with them. We were lucky enough to hit the right nerve, I guess, and develop some equipment that we had no idea anybody else would be interested in. So that allowed us to work worldwide from our little base here at Argyle, Manitoba, and affect a lot of acres. And so this is something that I want to present for thoughtfulness for you, is just take a look, think back to what you can do for the environment, for the ecology, And there's a whole bunch of things that I think anyone, if you have a skill or you have an interest in something, use that to help in this work. And if you can, use native seed wherever you're planting. Even if it's only a small corner of your yard or an apartment balcony or a city boulevard, or it's a back 40 on a farm, or perhaps an industrial lot, or a public park. These areas now are becoming more and more common. They are wonderful for our species diversity and for our ecology. Anyway, so I hope I've given people some food for thought tonight, and I'll be happy to take any questions if anyone has any, or you can get a hold of us through Living Prairie or hold of me. I can get the contact information to Cam. We have a resources sheet here that I prepared, or it's several sheets of all kinds of different resources that you could use. Some of the information sources that I've used to prepare this talk, some great books around now. Naturescape Manitoba, for example, is a great one if you're interested in doing this on your own property. I'll put a plug in for Living Prairie. They have the best native plant bookstore in all of Canada. So if you've never been to Living Prairie at 2795 Ness Avenue in Winnipeg, drop by and take a look at the prairie. Of course, it's a beautiful 40-acre tallgrass prairie remnant in the middle of the city, but they have an incredible bookstore. And also we'll be doing some more detailed workshops on the topic of native plant landscaping later on in the spring. So anyway, I'll shut up for now and allow Cam to take over and try to field any questions that may come up.
Oh, thank you so much, John. Yeah, and thanks for plugging Living Prairie. Yeah, we're in the process of ordering some more books, so everyone should check it out. And yeah, well, thank you so much for your spectacular presentation. It's amazing to see the impact that you've had across the whole world. Yeah, I've had the chance actually to walk through a longleaf pine savanna before in Florida, and what an interesting habitat that is. It was actually just after a controlled burn, I think. So
Yeah.
awesome.
We were down there, and I was just expecting a T-Rex to come walking around one of the trees. It looked like something I have never seen before.
It's like an alien environment.
Yeah, really cool. But yeah, it was like a tall grass prairie with a huge overstory of these massive pine trees.
Yeah, so let's dive into some questions. We have a lot of awesome questions in here. So yeah, we'll start with a question from Liz, who asked, what can I plant in Whitemouth Lactobani area to contribute to prairie grass or prairie habitat?
Well, yeah, what couldn't you plant? I could list off 150 species if I had enough time, but what I would suggest is that there's a really good resource, several good resources in our sort of handout from this. And I believe, Cam, you'll be able to send it out to people if they provide their emails. Is that correct?
Yes, I can do that. You can also reach out. I'll type it into the chat, prairie@winnipeg.ca. If you'd like to request the resources. I'm not sure, John, do you have it as a link or is it a file?
I have it as a PDF. So yeah, it's just basically, it's the native plant nurseries. It's some books, things like Naturescape and Restoring Our Canada's Native Prairies. Websites, there's some great websites now. Living Prairie website is one of the best. There's another great one in Saskatchewan too, the Saskatchewan Native Plant Council, and then also Tallgrass Ontario down in Ontario. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of eclectic variety of some of my favorite resources on this topic. So I'll have that to you, not tonight, but I'll have it to you tomorrow. And then if folks want to give you an email address, then be happy to send it out, because that I think would answer your question more so than me trying to give you, a plant list, because there's a lot of choice in this, from grasses to wildflowers to shrubs and things. So yeah, maybe stay tuned and get a hold of Cam.
Yeah, actually what I can do is I will upload the resources to a link, and then I could send it out to everyone in the chat. That might be an easier way, but
sure. Okay.
Alternative, send us an email, prairie@winnipeg.ca. So the next question was from Linda. Well, is there anything that can be done to protect what remains of our prairie? Perhaps talking about prairie remnants that are left.
Yeah. You know, that's a great question, Linda. Thank you. And you've kind of given me a bit of a soapbox. But yeah, there is a lot of stuff we can do. And one of my favorite things, I spent a year or so working in the Department of Natural Resources in government in a former life. And it was amazing when I worked there, what would happen when people, this was in the days before email, but they would write a letter to the minister. And it would go to the minister, and of course he didn't answer it. It was the lackeys down the line that answered it because they were the specialists. And that still works today. I'm not sure if it does as well, you know, with so many emails bouncing around, but it certainly doesn't hurt. The one of the major issues in preserving prairie remnants is that there is absolutely no protection for prairie remnants on private land. Private landowner can do whatever they want. They can pave it over, they can plow it up, they can build a high rise on it, they can do whatever they want. Public land is a little bit different. It is usually better managed, but it depends what public agency owns them. So if it's a public land, and one of the examples that comes to mind are roadsides. And I could give you a whole talk on roadside prairies because we have lots of them here in Manitoba. Even in places where there is no prairie for 50 miles, like in the middle of the Red River Valley, you'll find a beautiful little remnant sometimes along the edge of a roadway that's never been plowed up. And so those ones, being crown owned, you know, they are subject to some influence. So write a letter, give a phone call. Private land that, say, is owned by railways. Railways are famous for having high quality rights of ways that are native prairie, because the railways in many cases went through here 100 years ago or more, and they very jealously guarded their right of way, not only the trackway, but another 50 or 100 feet on either side. And in some cases, those have stayed undisturbed, and they've stayed amazing. So, you know, putting pressure on CN or CPR, or the Prairie Dog Central or something like that. Any of the railways that are active, you know, they're bound. All of them have some decent remnants. They may not even know what they are or where they are, but if you find them, point them out to people, point them out to them, and say, look, you know, what are you doing about this to preserve it? Because without preservation and without some management, they won't be there, you know, in another 20, 30 years. So yeah, I would say the best thing you can do is to keep pressure on politicians. Learn as much as you can about the site yourself. Talk to the landowner if you don't already know them. And then we are actually giving a whole workshop this spring on managing a prairie remnant. So if you keep an eye on the website, the Living Prairie website, and I'll be talking about that in a whole evening session with some optional field work that can go with it too.
Thanks so much, John.
Okay.
I'm gonna move on to the next question. It was from Jenny. What is the best time to dig up lawn or cover up lawn in preparation for changing over to a native garden? And where's the best place to get advice on that process?
Well, the resources list has some good advice on that. The book Naturescape, which was put out by a whole bunch of wonderful people from Winnipeg and Manitoba on how to do this kind of thing in Manitoba. We also did our own book called Restoring Canada's Native Prairies. That book is available free online if you just search for that title. It's in our resources list as well. And that talks about the methods you're talking about covering over some existing sod and cleaning it up for a native prairie planting.
Great, and I'll just I'll look for the link. I can probably post that into the chat.
Yeah, if you want.
Maybe while you're...
It's under, well, it's on Google Books, but it's also on naturenorth.com.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, here, I just found it. I'm going to post it into the chat. This is a really good starting place. And
Great.
It's free. Yeah, I just posted the link there, the Nature North link in the chat.
Yeah, and it is free, and it has a whole chapter on site preparation for native planting.
Another question from Larry. Do you have to cut down these native species in the fall?
You know, I don't tend to do it in the fall. There's some really interesting, fairly new research that shows that standing vegetation, standing prairie plants, grasses and flowers and whatnot over the winter can harbor a lot of insect species, butterflies, little beetles, or all kinds of critters that we might not even know are there. And so if you cut them down in the fall, it can affect their survival. If you do that, then make sure you just leave it in place, and you know, don't cart it away and take it off site or throw it in the garbage or something. On larger sites, and Living Prairie is one of, I guess, probably the pioneers in this, larger prairie remnants and even prairie restoration plantings, we actually burn off, usually in the spring. So we let it stand all winter and then burn it off. And that the whole concept of using fire to manage native grassland is it's a very, it might sound counterintuitive, but it is a very important technique that land managers and biologists use to manage prairies, because most native grasslands, probably worldwide, almost all of them, had fire as an important part of maintaining their health, keeping trees and shrubs at bay, and now keeping some of the non-native weedy species at bay. But if you've got a native planting, if you want to, or if you think it looks better cut down, the best time to cut it down is in the spring. So leave it up for the winter and then cut it down the following spring.
Okay, the next question was from Cliff. How far can you move native plant seeds without feeling guilty about invasive genetics, in quotes?
Good point. I could go on about this all night, but I decided not to. You know, basically, as close as you can, the closer the better. And sometimes the closest genetics you can get, or the closest source of a particular seed of a species, it might be 100 miles, it might be 300 miles, but it also quite likely would be, you know, maybe a few miles if you live in and around, say, Winnipeg in the Red River Valley. If you live anywhere in southern Manitoba, you're probably relatively close, like within 5 or 10 miles of at least a little bit of prairie. Maybe it's along a roadside, maybe if it's in a provincial park or wildlife management area, maybe it's on some private land. It's got some pasture or something that's still native. But so the closer the better. To give you an example, the project that we did for Nature Conservancy at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, we set ourselves a limit of about, I think it was 20 kilometers, and we collected 1,600 pounds plus of 122 species in 2 seasons. For that 86-acre planting, and that was all within 20 kilometers of the site we planted it. So that's, I mean, that's pretty well perfect. If you can do that, we're lucky because we're at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, so we already had some fabulous high-quality prairies. They'd been burned in spring. They were managed well, so we had a ample seed to and a very good seed production year or two to collect that. But as close as you can, the closer the better.
A question from Carla. How small can a preserve be and still be useful? So what about around 2 acres of overgrown and unused pasture south of Niverville? Would it be worthwhile to try and nurture native species there?
Sure. I mean, nothing's too small. We have done several plantings on apartment balconies. So they're in 5-gallon pails on somebody's balcony, and they're put together to make it look like a prairie in a senior's residence. Because that's the only place we had. It was all concrete everywhere else because it was right downtown. So 2 acres is, I'd be ecstatic if I had a 2-acre prairie remnant to another one to work on. I work on several around here that are around that size, and I just love them. So yeah, you know, get some good advice from someone who knows what they're talking about in this, and start doing it. And it's a wonderful process. Don't expect to have it happen overnight. It's going to take a number of years, depending on what you're starting with and depending on your resources. But I can almost guarantee you that you'll enjoy the process, and you'll have fun and learn a lot in it. And at the end, well, it'll probably never end. There will probably be things that you'll want to do. And once you get that in good shape, you'll probably want to get another piece and use the seed from that one to plant the next one. But that's I think it's a fantastic experience, and I highly recommend it.
And Sandy asked, how deep into the soil is carbon stored on the
Carbon
prairie?
is stored as deep as the root systems go. I had a picture that I couldn't find today for my presentation, but I have some pictures of the root system of prairie plants. And I think, like I mentioned, the prairie is like the tip of the iceberg. So about 10% of the activity and the biomass, the living material, is above ground, and about 90% is below ground. And we have almost no idea what's going on down there. So as deep as those roots go, and some native plants have roots that go down well over 4 or 5 meters. So depending on the soil type, depending on where the water table is, you can have carbon fixation and storage going on at that depth. And the deeper it is, the better, because then your soil is much less likely to move. Sometimes topsoil, if the top vegetation gets stripped off or something, of course it can erode by wind or water, and then you can lose that carbon into river or back into the air. So as deep as those prairie plants go, and some of them have roots deeper than any tree, that's where your carbon and other things will be stored.
Okay, and Linda asked, are there any other big prairie restorations areas going on in Manitoba, I think?
Yep.
And
Yeah,
as a
there's a
two-part question, I
sure.
guess, has the government here shown initiative for protection or restoration of native prairies?
Right. Well, first question, are there other ones? Yeah, the first and the largest prairie restoration, I guess the first one ever in Canada, was started before we started working in this a few years, I guess, is out at Beaudry Provincial Park, just west on Roblin, west from Winnipeg and Headingley. And Beaudry Park, now there's over 400 acres of former cropland that was, I guess, in crop when the park was set aside, which, if I recall correctly, it was when I was in junior high school, maybe in the late 1960s. And the long-term plan there is to put another 600 acres of currently cultivated land that's part of the park into prairie. These kinds of things come and go with different governments and different priorities and budgets and whatnot. So other prairie restorations, well, the one at Tolstoy at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve I mentioned. There are some that have been done on CFB Shiloh. There's some residential plantings in around Winnipeg and some of the neighborhoods. And in Headingley as well. So some of the newer subdivisions have some prairie grasses planted. I don't know if they're a diverse prairie or not. I'm not sure. So there are a few. There's not a huge program. It can take a lot of logistics and resources and financing and that type of thing to get one going. As far as governments, when we first started this work, it was, I guess, it was kind of like the lunatic fringe and are you crazy? But very quickly, we had the government on board, the provincial government at the time, and even the federal government later on, because they realized how endangered this was. It was just something that had been under the radar for so long. I mean, one of the things I remember talking in a minister's office one day, I said, we're a prairie province here in Manitoba, yet we have no prairie left. We have less than 1%. And so how can we call ourselves a prairie province? Well, you just go outside the city and it's all prairie, right? No, it's not. It's mostly agricultural cropland. It hasn't been prairie for 100 years. And most of those species are gone. So I think there's a number of different programs with the provincial government now, the Habitat Heritage Corporation and their Habitat Trust Fund. So they are much, much more on board with prairie conservation and restoration and the wildlife that depends on it. Federal government too, the Environment Canada has prairie biologists. They work right across the country, and national parks in under federal jurisdiction have some incredible prairie programs. Things like Grasslands National Park, Prince Albert National Park. I was up there, and it's sort of, you'd think that was out of the prairie region, but they're doing all kinds of prairie stuff up there, including a free release of bison. that are not even fenced in, and they're back on the prairie out there. Riding Mountain Park is doing a lot of work on prairie restoration, and they have what's called the rough fescue prairie. So they're kind of in the transition zone between the prairies and the forests. So yeah, I think government agencies are really coming along. I don't see too much in terms of municipal governments yet. I don't think they have had much push to do that. But what's really encouraging here in Manitoba are the watersheds, the watershed districts. They're doing a lot in this area and trying to fund and help landowners to do this. So yeah, I think governments are really coming along, and I'm happy to see that. City of Winnipeg too, I guess I should mention. Cameron, you could probably correct me on this, but you have hundreds of acres of prairie that you've restored in the city, is that right?
Yeah, we do a lot of prairie restoration with the city of Winnipeg too.
Right.
I mean, if you go to a neighborhood like Sage Creek or Bridgewater Forest, all the new retention ponds are naturalized. They're not quite a fully diverse prairie, but it's a big start.
To start, yeah.
And our branch also manages a lot of the remnant prairies across the city of Winnipeg too. So it's there, and we're doing our own work too. I can think of a new one on Wellington Crescent. It's gone in last year, I think it started, or the year before. And I just saw Marilyn mentioned Hentelif Park. That was the Hentelif Park Foundation, but there's a prairie restoration there. Yeah, there's a lot of work being done in the city. More and more, I think it's growing. Yeah.
Right. I think Winnipeg is at the forefront of this. I mean, Living Prairie Museum was set up. I can remember I was in about grade 7, and I lived in St. Charles at the time. And, it was really cool for me. I wasn't a biologist and I didn't know any plants really, but I thought it was really neat. And then, it was far ahead of its time in Canada. I mean, there was nothing else like Living Prairie until many, many years later, if not 20 or more years later. And even then, the Living Prairie, your educational program there and your focus on prairie has been, a model for many other cities across North America.
Well, thanks for that.
Your check's in the mail.
Yeah. Robin asked, what percentage of seeds is safe to take from one plant before it harms its reproduction?
Really good question. I think that there's no hard and fast rules on this, but when we're out seed collecting, and I've done this for 35 years now, we try not to take more than about 60% of the seed at any given time. That's a very conservative estimate. When you think about it, native plants are producing seed because they want you to take them. Maybe not you specifically. They evolved for bison to take them, or pronghorns, or grasshoppers, or sharp-tailed grouse, or prairie chicken, or whatever, and take them and maybe eat them, but some of those seeds would pass through the digestive system and get plopped out on the prairie in a pile of fertilizer some distance away. So the plants are producing seed because they want those seeds to disperse. So taking seeds off a prairie plant to me is a natural. It's a good thing. I do it almost unconsciously whenever I'm out in the prairie. I'm always putting seeds in my pocket and taking them and dumping them somewhere else where I hope they'll grow. You'd be quite safe if you took around 50-60% of the seed of any given plant or of any given site. And especially if you're using those seeds to replant prairie, then way to go.
Amy asked, once you establish a native prairie habitat, do you need to do anything to maintain it if it's an area you cannot burn?
Yeah, and that's often the case, of course, in urban areas. It's difficult to burn. Living Prairie does it. We've done burns right downtown at the Forks and on Taylor Avenue, and I know you folks have done burns in many other places, but on the average yard, it tends to be frowned on. One of our customers, though, Randy Penner, he came up with a brilliant solution to this, and I've always loved this. So what he does is he leaves his prairie standing up all winter, and then in the spring he cuts it down after the snow goes, but before it starts to green up, and then he puts it in his barbecue or fire pit and burns it. And so that's within the law, as long as you don't have a 25-foot, flame coming up there and you burn it all at once. So over the space of a day or so, or whatever it takes, he burns it all, and then he spreads the ash out on the prairie where he's just mowed it down. So I think that mimics a controlled burn in the best and safest way I can imagine. And to my knowledge, that's not against any rules or regulations in any town or any city or municipality.
Well, that's clever, spreading the ash on the garden. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, fire is as you know, we could spend a whole evening talking about fire, or a whole day, but fire ecology is extremely interesting and something that's very important to the prairie. But it's something that we don't know why it works. But we know that prairies have evolved with fire for thousands of years, for millennia, really. And the prairie and the fire and the plants and the animals are all adapted to that. It's part of the ecology. It's part of the genetics, really. And some of our prairies, for example, here on the farm, we've had planted prairies now for 27 years. And they are burned every spring, and they just keep getting better and better every year. So it's a really important part of it. But if you can't do it, if it's in the city, and of course it's not safe to burn next to a cedar fence or something like that, or your neighbor's cedar fence or garage, then this is I thought this was a brilliant way that Randy came up with this and told us about it. So.
Linda asked, are farmers becoming more understanding of the need to leave areas for prairie and wetland?
It's interesting. I guess as with anybody, it varies. I spent the first quite a few years as a wildlife biologist working with farmers on what we call private stewardship. So protecting wildlife habitat, wetland, prairies, woodlands on private farmland, rather than turning it into crown land and having the government own it. And some farmers, what I found, and I think this probably generally holds true, farmers who have cattle tend to have a lot more of a feel and more of a connection to the prairie. And I was just back from a conference last week in Calgary, the Prairie Conservation Endangered Species Conference. And there is a big representation in both Saskatchewan and Alberta of ranchers who have cattle on native prairie, and they are very much a conservation force out there. In Manitoba, there are some for sure. My master's study actually that I did out in Western Manitoba was on that topic, and what would a farmer, an individual farmer, like to see in terms of programs on the landscape that could help wildlife but also benefit the farmer. And the farmers and ranchers who had cattle were much more interested in that than straight grain farmers. And that is something that unfortunately is changing. There isn't as much native pasture out there anymore. There's not as many ranchers, especially in Manitoba. And much of the land that could be plowed up is being plowed up because of economics. When you're looking at land prices of $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $10,000 an acre in some places, if it's just native prairie, some people will look at it and say, hey, I can make a lot more money per acre growing canola or growing corn or something like that, or wheat. And unfortunately, without some good government policy to help pay the difference between plowing it up or keeping it for a landowner, the individual landowner might want to keep it because it's probably been that way for generations since it was homesteaded. But when that land changes hands, and it changes hand for a high dollar value, it almost always goes into cropland, and there goes the prairie. So it's it's not a malicious thing, and it's not a criticism of farmers, but it's just an economic reality. And this is not just in Canada, this is all over the world. So I don't know the answer, but I do know that providing more options, working with farmers who are interested in keeping native prairie is very beneficial. And it certainly is being well done out in Saskatchewan and Alberta. They're still losing lots of prairie, like I mentioned, over 1 million acres a year in Western Saskatchewan and Southern Alberta. But they have kept more prairie out there than anywhere else in Canada. And whether that's going to continue, it's hard to say.
Well, thanks, John.
Hey,
We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to try and get through these questions.
okay.
There's a few more questions here. So Bill asked, what do you suggest when you hear about city bylaws that seem to discourage taller native prairie plantings in residential spaces, like especially front yards?
Yeah, I think some of the best things to do there is education. Um, Having a sign up saying that, no, this is not me, that I forgot to mow my grass. This is an intentional tall grass prairie planting, and it's home for pollinators. It's home for songbirds. It's beautiful, and it is not just let go and it turns to weeds. Again, pressure on your counselor and the council and the mayor's office. If they're not doing, if they're not behaving reasonably, and even if they are, just, send a letter and say, hey, this is why we're doing this. We don't understand why you're against it. And I guess using our power as voters and our power as citizens and our public voice is the only way I can think of to do this properly.
Okay, and a question from Robin. Robin is working on removing buckthorn from a forested area. So that's European buckthorn.
Mhm.
Any suggestions for competitive seeding or planting in the area once buckthorn is removed?
Well, I don't have a lot of experience with buckthorn, but I've certainly seen it in places, and what it's displaced in those areas, it would make sense to me to try to replace it. So the areas of river bottom forest that the buckthorn have invaded, I mean, if you look at some of the natural river bottom forest that still remains in places like Beaudry Park and a few other places along the Assiniboine and Red River, the kind of understory shrubs that you had there would be a good thing to replace it. Some of the ostrich ferns, some of the shrubs, some of the willows like sandbar willow and peach-leafed willow, and some of the grasses, sort of the semi-shade tolerant grasses like Canada wild rye, and even to some extent big blue stem. And putting in some of the other trees like cottonwoods and where it's a bit drier, bur oak. So providing some competition, I think, is the only way. I'm not sure, like I say, I'm not an expert on this, so maybe some of your staff with the city would probably know more, but that would be what I would think as an ecologist saying that try to replace what was there before the buckthorn took over.
And then a question from Cliff. How do you get rid of smooth brome and reed canary grass to replace with native prairie?
Yeah, smooth brome and reed canary are a couple of the worst invaders, non-native grasses, that and Kentucky bluegrass and quackgrass, I guess. Those four species they're pervasive, they're non-native, they're aggressive, and they're a real bane for people trying to restore prairie. A couple of ways. I mean, if you want to do it on a small scale, you can completely cover the area with, say, a black tarp or black plastic and let it fry in the sun for a month or two in the spring and early summer. That should kill most of the seeds and the plants in the top few inches of the soil. It won't do much for any deep-rooted grasses or weeds. But what in many cases, we have to use herbicides to get rid of those kinds of species. And then the best time to spray them is mow them once or twice, maybe a couple of times during the summer, let them regrow in late summer and fall, and then spray them just before freeze up. So early to mid-September. That helps the herbicide translocate into the root system when they're storing their energy there for the winter time, and you can kill the whole plants really, really well. And herbicide that we use is a glyphosate or Roundup type herbicide. And although there is controversy over them, they are nowhere near as toxic as many of the other broadleaf herbicides that are used for many other things. So it's not a perfect solution, but battling those species is a real battle. And I like to use everything that I can to try to give the native species an edge in that kind of battle.
And Carla asked, how do you find landscapers who will be willing to use and be knowledgeable about native plants in their plans?
I think you just have to ask them. There's more and more landscape architects now that know about planting prairie. There used to be very, very few of them. So there are, check with them, ask them for experience. Some people say, oh yeah, native planting, it's easy. How hard can it be? The plants grow in the wild. So how hard can it be? Well, it takes some specialized knowledge, and it's not like planting petunias or English tea roses. So yeah, ask them and get some references and see what their track record is. That would be my suggestion.
Okay, and there's a question about a bare backyard space invaded by creeping Charlie. They'd like to incorporate native plants and wondering the best way to get rid of the creeping Charlie without using products that adversely affect the area.
Right. Well, again, creeping Charlie, yeah, it's a really aggressive broadleaf weed. So short of physically replacing the soil, which is very expensive and no guarantee, because quite often even one little bit of root of that plant will give you another 50 plants in a year or so. So using a non-selective herbicide like a glyphosate herbicide carefully so that you don't get it into the surrounding vegetation or on other plants that you want to keep. And do it when the creeping Charlie is growing well and green and lush. And that's when the herbicide will have the most impact. It can be a difficult one, but if you do get on top of it and keep it out of there for a year or two, they'll probably never get rid of all the seed in there. So you may still have to watch for it when you plant your native species in there, but be diligent in weeding. And, I'm not going to say it's going to be perfect. You may always have some, but if you can keep it in bay, once the prairie plants get well established, then they can do a fairly good job of out competing with it.
And I think this is our last question. Have you worked with any school boards who are restoring their unused turf back to native habitat? I see this as a huge untapped opportunity for both students and the land.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the first projects we ever did was with Elmwood High in Winnipeg, and we did just that. They had an unused area at the back of the schoolyard, and it hadn't been for over 100 years, and it did incredibly well. So yeah, then there are programs now that help schools and teachers and students and parent councils to do this type of thing. So I think that it's a great learning experience for the kids and the teachers and the parents. And there is tons of space that could be used for this. And many schoolyards, as you probably know, are just biological deserts. There's hardly anything natural out there, and having a place where the kids can watch a jackrabbit or see a meadowlark or a dragonfly or some butterflies is just awesome. And so I agree. I don't think there's enough, no, but it's been when we first started doing this many years ago, it was almost unheard of. I think Elmwood was the first school in one of the first in Canada to do this, if not the first. And yeah, it was been pretty exciting to see many other school projects over the years. And there's a lot that I don't know about.
Yeah, actually, one of the things we do at Living Prairie Museum is butterfly garden programs for schools.
Right.
So we have limited capacity. We do about 5 a year, but we help them install a butterfly garden.
Great.
And it's a very popular program, and it's just a little patch, but you start small and hopefully expand over time.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, that seems to wrap up all our questions. We have a lot of awesome comments. Kudos. Thanks, John. I think this one sums it up. Gosh, John, you're a mine of information. Truly inspiring suggestions and information, and lots of comments like that. Take a look at the chat, John. But thank you, everyone. Sure. Thank you for I think your passion for the prairies is infectious, and I think you've inspired a lot of people tonight, and me as well. So thanks again. And I'll just
thank you. My pleasure. Anytime.
Yeah, and everyone here, I posted the link to register for our next talk, March 21st at 7 p.m. Native Plants for Native Lawns with Ash Burkowski. So there's a link to register for that one there. Yeah, the chat's filling up with thanks. So thanks again, John, for joining us, spreading the good word.
Thank you. And you guys keep up the good work too. And thank you, everyone. Happy planting.
Yeah. Good night, everyone.
Good night.